I will start the recording and then we'll go over the syllabus really quickly just to give a reminder what's going on. We've got just a couple quick topics to touch on from chapter 6. Then we're going to go through a lot of chapter 7 today and then finish that up on Thursday. Then we will be starting chapter 8 next Tuesday. So also next weekend, so March 5th and 6th, is going to be your second unit exam. Just as a reminder, that will cover chapters 8, 7, 6, and 5. So the 4 chapters that we've covered since Unit Exam 1. So it is only covering those 4 chapters. It's all multiple choice, open book, open notes. I do recommend you review Chapter 1 material just to keep it fresh in your mind for the final exam, but none of the questions in Exam 2 are actually from Chapter 1. Obviously, we've built on information from Chapter 1, so if you remember that stuff, it'll help you, but yep, we're just building up in the ages as we go along. Also, your midterm question paper is due on March 5th as well. So with that, make sure that you're thinking about questions. Hopefully you've already started doing some research, like looking into Google Scholar or PsycInfo to find some good articles for your papers. If you still haven't come up with a topic by, say, next Tuesday, and then probably let me know and see if you've got a couple ideas. Like, let me know what ideas you have, and I can maybe suggest some specific topics or some specific articles that might be useful to you. I've had one person turn it in so far, and so getting it done this weekend might be a little easier than getting it done next weekend when you're also studying for an exam. So any logistical questions about the exam, it's going to be a really similar format to the first one. Your study guide is up and available to you. So you should find that in the Unit 2 material, so Unit Exam 2 study guide. So definitely go over that in between now and Exam 2. All right, well, let's get finished with Chapter 6, and then we will jump into Chapter 7. All right, so we finished up talking about divorce. Now let's talk about some aspects of after divorce, some things that we're going to go through these last couple slides really quickly in Chapter 6 so we can get to Chapter 7. But there are a couple key points I definitely want to point out. So one of the big things for after divorce, again, for Chapter 6, we're still in early childhood. So think 3, 4, 5-year-olds at this time. So, but a lot of these also apply to middle and late childhood as well. So the more harmonious the relationship is between the parents after a divorce, the better. So the more authoritative parenting is correlated with more positive outcomes. Also, individual factors of the children are important too. So things like their personality, their temperament, the child's adjustment in this family setting. So that's one reason why therapy can be really useful for a child individually. So helping them build specific skills for coping. So the more skills that they have to cope with the situation, the more resilient they are in that situation. So with cross-cultural studies in the family, interestingly, even though we're talking about family system dynamics, and family is one of the core components of that developmental model that we're looking at. So one of the big aspects of the bidirectional interaction between children and their parents or siblings, there's not as much research in this area as you might expect. So a really good area to do further research in, whether it's for your question paper or whether it's for you want to go into looking at this in the future. So let's say you and your family are from a different culture than the majority culture in the US. Maybe that would be a good area to dive into and look into for a question paper, or if you wanted to do research on that in the future. So looking at, do these findings fit in the culture you grew up in or your parents grew up in or grandparents? Things like that are a really good thing for the field to learn about, especially from someone who has direct connections with that culture. So with this being said, a few things that we know: rural areas do tend to have more authoritarian parenting as opposed to authoritative or permissive or neglectful. So many places in the world actually have a lot more generations living with children. So whether that's under one roof or in a close proximity, like in a neighborhood, you've got, say, the grandparents in the house right next door or in the apartment right next door. So many places in the world have a lot of generations living with children. So this can include also aunts and uncles. This adds a lot of resources for children. It's a really positive thing on average. That being said, for smaller families, they do tend to have more open communication with children in early childhood, middle, late, adolescence. So that's a really good positive for smaller families. Ethnically, there are some differences in the US. So for ethnic minority groups, there does tend to be more probability that they'll have more families in close proximity, like grandparents nearby or under the same roof, aunts and uncles nearby or under the same roof, cousins. And so that gets children in early, middle, adolescence to interact with more people that are close to them, who are similar in some ways to them, who maybe come from similar backgrounds and cultures as them. So it gives them a lot more opportunity for socio-emotional development, gives parents some more opportunity for support from, say, grandparents or aunts or things like that. So that can be really positive and a really protective factor for these children. So one thing that maybe we could all take and learn from families being close in proximity to each other can have a lot of positive benefits. With this as well, another difference is that ethnic minorities in the US tend to be lower SES. There's a lot of socio-historical and political reasons for that. But essentially, this creates a really big risk factor for a lot of ethnic minority groups. And so that, one, changing the system can really help with that. But also, this risk factor can be protected against individually by parents working to find schools, looking to find community groups or resources for their children. So this is relevant in early childhood, but also middle, late, and adolescence. So, I mean, these points that I'm making here kind of put that responsibility on the parents. Hey, find these additional supports. But also this means that as communities, as groups, as states or cities, we need to be able to provide these kinds of supports for people. Not just to be accessed by ethnic minority groups, but having additional supports for all people, including all people of lower SES, is really relevant and important. So when talking about family systems, there's a song by the band Chevelle called Family System. Chevelle is one of my favorite bands, so every time I see these slides and it says Family Systems at the top of it, all of the time my brain just keeps jumping to Chevelle. So I had to put it here. Here's a link to the song on YouTube. We're not going to watch it as a class because it's totally irrelevant. But if you're interested, go for it. Also, Chevelle has a new album coming out in like 10 days or so that I'm really excited for, just in time for my birthday. So that's exciting. All right, so last topic in early childhood is play, and then we'll talk about media use. So play, just like in infancy and middle childhood, play is super important for developing children. So they have socio-emotional interactions, they're able to play games, they have cognitive development, their gross and fine motor skills are building at this time in doing play. So engaging them in play is really, really relevant. So having formalized groups or clubs or team sports is really good. Also just having things to play with. So in a house or in a yard or going to a park, these things can be really, really good for a child's development. So I mentioned those skills. So there's a couple different types of play. Sensory, motor, and practice play is basically building the senses like sight, hearing, smell, those kinds of things, and motor skills, both gross and fine motor skills. Practice play is kind of repeating new skills and new behaviors. So building blocks or building Legos, putting letters in the order of an alphabet, for example. So for someone later on in early childhood, they might have letter magnets that they can put on the fridge in the correct order, or start to practice spelling their name or something like that. So also pretense or symbolic play is using other objects as stand-ins for the things that they are. So you'll see this as they get into early childhood and further on through early childhood, that maybe a 2-year-old would not pick up a yellow ball and say, hey, this is a Pikachu. But a 4-year-old might be a lot more likely to say, hey, you play with this. This ball is Pikachu. This brown ball is Eevee. So that's what we're talking about, symbolic play. This helps with thinking abstractly as well, and it really shows that they're starting to think abstractly. So that neurological development really needs to happen before you see this kind of jump in pretending one object is something else. So, and this is probably one of the reasons that when my children were a little younger and my older child tried to do symbolic play, saying, hey, pretend this is this thing, the younger child would say, no, this is a truck, or this is a ball. I would not be okay with it being a symbolic thing. So social play is interacting with peers, and then constructive play is combining a lot of these things. This is what you would tend to see in, say, a preschool or kindergarten, or maybe even first grade setting, where you have games, specific settings, where you're combining these sensory motor experiences, learning, and play all together. All right, so media and screen time. So children have a lot easier access to screens and screen time than they did in generations past. Part of that's just because technology has become cheaper, more accessible, things like that. So 2 to 4-year-olds watch about 2 to 4 hours of TV a day on average. This was before the pandemic. So I've seen some research that says some of this has been even doubled. So the Pediatrics Association recommends less than an hour of screen time a day. So that would include like a phone or a tablet, a TV, video games, less than an hour a day. So with that being said, though, there are different kinds of programs that even with that hour, or if you're doing more than that with screen time, there are certain types of programs that have been researched to be more beneficial than others. So active programming can have a lot of positive benefits. What I mean by active programming, one of the most common examples that I hear jokes about a lot is actually Dora the Explorer. So Dora the Explorer will ask you something like, can you find the map, or can you find this color berry, or something like that, and talk to the screen and then wait there. And so as an adult, you might be watching that and be like, hey, this is kind of weird. I don't want to talk to your screen. You're a screen. But for a child, interacting like that is very beneficial, or can be very beneficial. So with that, if they have just entertainment that's just for entertainment purposes, that's not interactive, and trying to build their skills and have them interact with the characters on screen, they have a higher probability of becoming a more passive learner. So passive learning is not as good as active learning. A lot of, say, lecturing is oftentimes passive. That's why doing activities or papers or getting involved with it are some of the best aspects, I think, of this course to get you more involved. Because we do have all this material we've got to get to you and try to get it at least into your brains, but getting you more involved and working with it, while it might be more time consuming, it is better for your learning. So additionally, the models on TV might not demonstrate appropriate socio-emotional skills. So just this morning, my daughter really likes this show, Star versus the Forces of Evil. And some of those characters are really mean to each other. So I'm really debating if she should watch it. And just because of how mean they are to each other sometimes. And it's oftentimes played off as jokes, and she laughs at it. But at the same time, these aren't appropriate socio-emotional skills that these characters are demonstrating. So there's that trade-off there. That's my dilemma today that I've been wondering about. So with this, watching educational programs with a child is really helpful. So similar to what we do here, we'll watch, say, a YouTube video about a topic, and then we'll talk about it. Doing that same kind of thing with a child as they're watching, say, Dora the Explorer, or one of my favorite early childhood programs is Daniel Tiger. So that's really helpful. So talk about the things, debrief, ask questions, maybe pause in the middle and ask, what do you think this character is going to do? What do you think this character is feeling? Those kinds of things. Obviously, that takes a lot more energy and time for a parent or a caregiver than just putting them in front of a good educational show while you've got to do something like cook dinner. So dinner is important too, proper nutrition, you know? So these are some examples of useful shows for early childhood. So Daniel Tiger is one of my favorites. I like the songs. I actually use them to talk to my kids about like emotion regulation very often. So a lot of emotion regulation skills is taught here. Super Why teaches a lot of like reading and understanding the story and like the logic of stories. Little Einsteins goes through a lot of different art, word world, identifying letters, numbers, things like that. Dora the Explorer, I don't really watch Dora the Explorer. I'm not sure for that. Sesame Street does a lot of different things, a huge variety. Very interestingly, there are, I would dare say, because heroism is a small area of research, I would dare say there are more papers published on Sesame Street than on heroism. So there's more, yeah, interesting. It's one of the first programs that was intended to help children with their education. So it got evaluations and studies early on. So you can find papers. When did Sesame Street start? Basically, right from the time it started, it was getting papers published about it to see what is working, what is not working. And even now, there's evaluations done of Sesame Street that you can go and read if you wanted to do a question paper about Sesame Street. There's peer-reviewed research on Sesame Street that you can look up, and they recently have been evaluating things like how is it doing with being accessible to more diverse groups, looking at specific things like neurodivergence, kids with ADHD or kids with autism, looking at people of a variety of gender identities. So there's a lot of good research done in Sesame Street, as well as things like, hey, is it teaching math well? Is it teaching to the level of a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old? Things like that. So you can find those kinds of evaluations and published research papers on Sesame Street. So good examples. I don't actually watch Sesame Street that much. My kids never really liked Muppets. I've always found Muppets to be like a little less creepy than ventriloquist dummies, but like ventriloquist dummies are like one of my like nightmare fears, and then Muppets are like a step below that. So I'm not really into Sesame Street, but as an academic, knowing that there's a lot of research in it, it's useful. And they're just little Muppets. They're not really scary. They're not gonna come and eat me or something. Sorry, very irrelevant tangent. So those are the main points I wanted to hit at the end of chapter 6. We'll move into chapter 7, which is also now a new age time. So middle and late childhood. Some developmental books will break these up into middle childhood and then late childhood, and that's a good way to do it because there are a lot of differences and changes between middle childhood and late childhood, socio-emotional differences and group dynamics and things like that. But with the time that we have in this class, our book puts them together. And so to get the entire lifespan, I think it is really useful to have middle and late childhood together. Just so you know, some of these facts will be more relevant for further on in later childhood. Some of them are more relevant to earlier on in middle childhood. And I'll try to point those out when there's a stark difference as we're going through. So physical health. Again, this is the time period between about 6 and 12. So depending on who you ask, adolescence starts as early as 12. Adolescence might start for some as late as 14. Depends on the researcher, depends on their definitions. I think it's really hard to say that adolescence doesn't start till 14 when you have even 12-year-olds starting puberty. So I think keeping that within adolescence is a good thing, a good defining line. But that's kind of where I am at on that. How far does late childhood go to? So 11, 12, pretty good time period. So with this, during this time, you should be seeing about 2 to 3 inches of height growth a year and about 5 to 7 pounds a year in weight. Most of this weight being added on is coming because the skeleton is still growing. It's ossifying, so it's getting more dense, as well as the organs themselves. As the body's getting bigger, the organs themselves are growing. So like stomachs or lungs or kidneys, so those organs. The brain also is getting a little bit bigger. By the end of late childhood, it's basically at the weight of an adult brain, but the brain isn't growing that dramatically in weight and size at this point. So, yeah, most of that growth coming from these organs. An additional point about the bones ossifying is in early childhood, bones are still quite bendy. So, a child who falls out of a tree or off of a playground equipment. They might have some pretty serious bruises, but maybe their bones are able to bend enough so they don't break. You tend to see more breaks in bones as they get further on in middle and late childhood. So by the end of late childhood, their bones are pretty dense at that point, versus at the end of early childhood, they're still pretty soft and bendy. So one thing to watch out for. Um, One point about the brain development in weight. So while everything by the end of middle and late childhood is pretty much in the proper place, you've got all the support structures for the brain as well, the other cells that are kind of holding things where they should go, the amount of fluids that an adult brain has. This doesn't mean that the brain is unchangeable. The dendrites, again, they can change, axon branches can grow within a day, right? So you can gain new skills. There's still a lot of plasticity in the brain, even though the structures are all there at the end of late childhood. So one of the big things that's happening here is the prefrontal cortex is starting its myelination, and also by the end of late childhood, most of the very middle, so like if you were looking at an MRI, the very middle of your brain will be myelinated by the end of that time. So early on in adolescence, a lot of emotional capacities are a lot higher. Gross and fine motor skills should be really good by the end of late childhood. So complex games, soccer, climbing, tennis, gymnastics, these kinds of things that require a lot of gross and fine motor ability, they should be pretty capable of them. So with this, boys are generally outperforming girls in gross motor skills, and girls are generally outperforming boys in fine motor skills. And a lot of this comes down to the myelination of the neurons in the prefrontal cortex. Just makes it easier and quicker to send messages to the hands to do a fine motor skill like play an instrument, like play a guitar or play a piano. So also a good time to be working on these skills too. So in middle childhood, starting learning an instrument can be really good at that time, versus before then. If children are interested, it's a really good thing. But before about middle childhood, they might not have the skills that they need, fine motor wise, to do it really well. If they're struggling with just putting their fingers in the proper places and moving them because they don't have that physical capacity yet, it can be really frustrating. But middle childhood, good time to start learning, and then through late childhood as well. All right. Handwriting also improves, unless you're me, and then it was good then, and it's just kind of taken a downward trend ever since middle childhood for me. So it's actually funny looking at like learning handwriting in school and like learning cursive up to I think like third grade, and then ever since then my writing has just gotten poorer and poorer and poorer. I think it's kind of leveled off. It's plateaued now. Um, Sorry for that tangent. So exercise. Exercise is really important, and children are not getting enough exercise in middle and late childhood. We'll talk about that a lot today, as well as for early childhood. A lot of that comes down to media consumption. So some of the things that children in middle and late childhood should be doing are things like playing with friends, playing in a park, or playing even organized team sports. They can do specific kind of workout programs. So this kid wanted to be like Jet Li. I almost said Jackie Chan. That's not Jackie Chan. Um, so, but specifically did workouts to be able to do those things, even works with nunchucks, things like that. So interesting example. But children should have about an hour in middle and late childhood of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So there are a lot of cognitive benefits for children of this age as well as into adulthood for this much physical activity. Things like attention being better, executive function being improved, academic achievement, inhibition control, working memory. And so we'll talk more about working memory a lot, probably Thursday. We'll get to that here in middle and late childhood. But a lot of these features of physical exercise apply here in childhood as well as throughout life. So and these are causal. So looking at children, having a group of children doing an experiment, taking a group of children, having them do exercise specifically, or having them do any exercise they choose, and then comparing them to a control group who's not doing anything different in their day-to-day lives. They see increases in all these things: attention, executive function, working memory, inhibition control. So physical activity is really good for people. You can think of this similarly to other mammals. So small lions, for example, they will play and they will fight, they'll stalk each other, they'll do things like that to learn the social skills of a lion. What do lions do? Similar children are doing those same things with their play and with their exercise. So through play, and they'll get that motor development, they'll get some cognitive skills, socio-emotional development, as well as socio-emotional challenges. Things don't always go great when you're playing in a group and people want to play different things or have different ideas or want to be it and the other people don't want to, and the other people want to be it, those kinds of things. So another big thing is that parents can model exercise behaviors to children. For children that have parents that model exercise, they're far more likely to exercise when they are adults than children of parents who they don't see exercising. Depending on the age, so towards late childhood, if the children are interested in doing specific workouts, you might even think about getting them involved in your specific workouts. So as an example, we switched over from a weightlifting program and we started doing like a cardio intensive program that was just body weight. And so doing that, my children saw it and they thought, hey, some of those movements are really funny and cool. So they like sat around and we gave them a pad and they tried them out with us. That being said, I probably wouldn't let my 8-year-old, well, unless I could see that they had the gross motor skills, lift weights with us, because I just don't think that she has those gross motor skills yet. But if that's something they're interested in, starting with very little weights or something like that, could be a good thing too. So helping them be physically active in something that they're engaged with, that they enjoy, whether it's an organized team sport like, say, soccer, or if they just like going outside and pretending to be a cat or something like that. Helping encourage them and support them in doing those things. PE as well has been really effective at improving fitness and lowering fat. So that's another area where there's been a lot of research about this. Oh, that's really interesting. So the comment is Rachel's very active and neither of the parents have regular workout routines, but your little sister, who's now 8, goes for jogs once in a while because of seeing you do it. Really interesting. I'm assuming that your sister also lives with you and so sees you doing that regularly, or maybe you just talk about it every once in a while. But yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if there's much research on that about specifically about the exercise modeling of older siblings that are significantly older than, significantly older than middle or late childhood children. So thank you for that example. That's really relevant. Maybe a good thing to look for if that's something you're interested in for a question paper as well. So what are middle and late children doing instead of being active? So let's get some votes in the meeting chat. What do you think children are doing instead of being active? The answer's pretty easy, but let's get some votes. Like, it's not a trick question. All right, I see some correct answers pouring in, some variations basically on the idea of screen time. So whether it's playing with a phone, playing with a tablet, uh, watching TV, or playing video games, kids are spending a lot of time on electronics. So we just talked about this at the end of early childhood, but it's also really relevant in middle and late childhood. And I picked this picture because this is actually a device that we had purchased for our children, that we bought. We're like, we're only going to use it on car drives. Like we have a long car like trip. Basically, we're driving from California to Utah, and we're like, we'll get this thing for them for that trip, so they can watch their own shows at their own time. And then we started giving it to them all the time, essentially. So this is very common for children to have a lot of media consumption, more than that recommended time a day. So this also leads us into one of the other risk factors for that is being overweight. So children in the US and China we've seen really high increases in overweight children in specifically those two countries. This phenomena happens in other developed countries as well, but some of the biggest changes, or most alarming changes, are in the US and China. So with this, heredity is a really important piece of the puzzle for how the body grows and develops, how much fat you store, things like that. And so that's still the case here. So if they have a risk factor genetically for being overweight, so if their parents are overweight, it's a lot more likely that they'll be overweight. But similarly, as we talked about in infancy and early childhood, the next biggest factor is their nutrition, what they're taking in. So how many calories, how many macronutrients, what kind of vitamins, those kind of things. So with this, some environmental changes that can really affect this is mealtime regularity. The more regular and structured mealtime is, on average, the lower a child's weight, and the more healthy foods they're eating, the more socio-emotional opportunities they're having, especially if you have a family that's able to sit down for meal times, whether it's just one meal a day or multiple meals throughout the day. The more regularity there is in that, the better off they'll be, or the more protective factors that gives. And this isn't always possible. If you've got multiple parents working and you've got multiple caregivers on different schedules, different work schedules, all sorts of things, then one day lunchtime might be 11 to even as late as 2 or something like that. And it might swing that wide. The more regular it is at the same time of day with people sitting down together, the better off, though. Screen time also has a really big impact on this. A lot of kids will watch a screen or play on a screen and eat snacks that tend to be less healthy. So it's kind of funny, though. Sometimes my child will ask for goldfish crackers, which aren't like the worst crackers in the world, but they're also not the best. So sometimes if he gets zoned out while watching a show, I will take his fishy crackers and I'll put like a bowl of apples in front of him and he'll just eat them. So probably he should get off the screen time at that time, but also I'm trying to get him to eat more fruits and vegetables. So it's like, hey, this is a trick. Even though he's maybe using too much screen time, he's getting a better nutritious snack. Schools that offer and emphasize healthy foods are also really beneficial for keeping children from being overweight. I'm actually really interested to see some psych research, probably that's going to start coming out now and in the future, to see for the specific programs during this pandemic that have sent a lot of school foods, like more healthy school foods, home or for pickup for people in a lot of places. So a lot of school food programs have basically been able to expand with some of the funding through this pandemic. So I'll be interested to see some of the cognitive, socio-emotional, as well as health benefits. You could probably find some medical research specifically about like medical outcomes and variables right now about that. But I'll like to see some of the other context variables as well. It does seem the medical field has a slightly different process of going from like putting in your paper to getting it published. It's a lot shorter than in the psych field. It's generally a little bit longer. Sometimes a paper that's put in isn't going to come out for about 9 months. Like you write your paper, you've done your study, and then you put it into the editors. It's probably going to be 9 months to a little bit over a year before that's actually out in front of people, which is a pet peeve and frustrates me to no end. when I see like medical research coming out within like they put it in the paper and within a couple months it's out. Um, there's a lot of reasons for it. Anyway, so again, an hour at least of moderate to vigorous physical activity can really help. And some of the big problems with this are these patterns that the middle and late children are building are going to be patterns that they keep through their lives. So obviously there's developmental plasticity. They can change their habits in the future. So so Rachel gave us the example of the sister who is 8 and is now jogging every once in a while. That sister could change behaviors in the future to jog a lot or have a lot of regular exercise, or change the other way and have very little physical activity later on in life. But the consequences of being overweight in childhood are hypertension, high blood cholesterol, and obesity in adolescence and adulthood. And so the high blood pressure and high cholesterol are some of the biggest causes of death as we get into early, middle, and late adulthood. So we definitely want to start these patterns of healthy behaviors early and try to keep them consistent throughout the lifespan. All right, so we talked about a couple of these points, but let's watch a little video that goes into some more depth on a few of them and has some other ideas as well from a medical practitioner of things that we can do to help reduce being overweight and obese, specifically in childhood. Some of the things that he says, and I'll try to point a couple out at the end of the video, but some of the things that are said in it are really relevant for late children versus early childhood versus middle childhood, but I'll try to point those out maybe in the middle of the video. Maybe I'll just pause it since there's a couple different topics.
The ultimate answer to the childhood obesity epidemic is to deal with what's been called our toxic environment. The junk food everywhere, advertising of unhealthful products to kids, inadequate opportunities for physical activity. But that's going to be a long-term prospect. We can begin to protect our children immediately in one environment through which we have 100% control, and that's the home.
So this is one thing that I wanted to talk about in my earlier class, but I didn't because it's at the beginning of the video and I forgot by the end. So sorry, we're just barely into this. He mentions that there's these systematic things within the broader context that kids are exposed to. So the advertising. So those are part of the bigger bubbles in that context model. And he says, well, we're going to focus some things on the family, which is really good. But also as people interested in children's well-being and who can do things like vote or participate in school boards or create groups and organizations in our communities, vote for federal elected officials, things like that. So anything from the small like neighborhood to broader community to city to state to federal level, there are things that we can do and things that we can try to push for as well. So to completely, oftentimes because it's harder to organize and get bigger systematic change, especially at the research level, just saying, hey, we'll talk about things that parents can do. That's kind of, and teachers can do this because it's a little easier to focus on those. But we shouldn't ignore these bigger, broader systematic changes that should be made to help support human well-being as well.
Parents can use very basic behavioral change practices to begin to guide their children to a healthy lifestyle right away. And that's, in fact, the focus of the work that we do in the Optimal Weight for Life, or the OWL program at Children's Hospital Boston. The two key parenting practices, really at any age, are called protecting the home environment and modeling. Protecting the home environment simply means if it doesn't support health, don't bring it in the home. You can say no once to your kids when they're asking you for that gallon of ice cream in the supermarket, or you can try to say no every night when they're nagging you for it if it's sitting in the freezer. The same also applies to physical activity. Let's not have a high-definition, widescreen television in every room. Let's put opportunities for physical activity, active games, kids can close the doors, have fun, and enjoy themselves. A second key parenting practice is called modeling. And the idea here is that if you do it, they'll do it. But the opposite is also true. If you don't do it, they won't do it. When parents are eating well and engaging in a physically active lifestyle, they'll be modeling the right behaviors for the overweight or obese child, and the parents' own cardiovascular risk factors improve. All too often, parents resort to negative practices like nagging, punishment, criticism. Very common for parents to try to force their kids to eat foods that they think are healthy, like fruits and vegetables, or excessively restrict other foods like candy. But these practices tend to backfire. They make the kid dislike fruits and vegetables and actually crave those restricted foods even more. Instead, we encourage practices like praise, goal setting, self-monitoring, something we call empowerment, where kids actually participate in food preparation, even food selection. And we have a saying that if they cook it, or if they select it in the store, they'll probably eat it.
So this is one of those examples that selecting something in a store or for a shopping list or even at home is a lot more, late children are a lot more capable of that than, say, early children. So someone in early childhood, they still have those problems with judgment. They're not necessarily like weighing costs and benefits as they're trying to decide which kind of cereal they want or something like that. So that's a lot more relevant for points for later childhood or even middle childhood. For an early child, still preparing the food and being interested in that, that is still relevant for them. Another thing I wanted to mention too that I recently learned actually from our pediatrician is there's new research coming out about like fruit pouches. So something that is fun and colorful and has a lot of fruits just like matched up together in smoothies. We've used with my youngest because he doesn't like eating the like crunchy vegetables. Interestingly, it's not uncommon for a lot of children, and there's actually been signs that children's jaws are getting weaker and their teeth are having more teeth problems because they're doing things like drinking their nutrients rather than chewing food. So, I mean, it makes sense. We evolved to chew roots and leaves and berries and meat and things like that. So we're now seeing other problems because we're trying to solve this one problem of they're not getting their fruits and vegetables, but it's causing this other problem too of their teeth are getting screwed up. So interesting new research as well. So, and it also shows the whole developmental system. So that the food choices are also going to be affecting things that you might not generally consider because it's a whole system of their teeth. And also thinking, well, also this child is within a system, within a community. What food sources do they have access to? Things like that. So it is, each of these is difficult developmentally to think about what can we do best to most optimally help a child. Any given one single study isn't going to answer all the questions, but a study might help answer, well, are these fruit pouches good for the teeth health of children as they get into adolescence? So one study might do that, and another study might be, what are good ways to help encourage a child to eat foods? And comparing, like you said, doing things like punishing versus some of these other techniques.
Many parents are working multiple jobs, leaving little time to shop for and prepare foods at home. Also, especially in some inner city communities, fast food is cheap and available, and nutritious food ingredients like fruits and vegetables can be very expensive or literally unavailable. Yet another factor is that children are under a lot of stress, almost ridiculously early in life. Young children are under academic pressures to exceed in scholastic studies. And this can not only limit time for being outdoors, playing, and relaxing, but also put so much stress on a young child that it influences their eating habits. They may turn to food for comfort, and obesity is the almost unavoidable consequence.
All right, So the last point I want to make is actually really relevant to that and not really covered in this textbook, but there's a lot of research on homework in children and the time that they have after school. And I don't want to go off too much in detail, but there's a lot of research on this. If it's something that sounds interesting to you, definitely let me know. I can send you some of these papers to get you started. But essentially, what research shows is that children who are in early childhood, middle childhood, basically until about high school time, they really shouldn't be having much, if any, homework. So in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, probably zero homework is appropriate. So there's a lot of contextual factors that are going into homework. One is the teacher's training. So if they trained to give homework, then they're probably going to be giving homework. The best thing developmentally for a child is to spend those, say, 6 hours in school doing things like learning. So part of the problem with that is we are also asking schools to do so many additional things in supporting the development of a child that it can be hard to get them the academic focus that they need all throughout school. One thing that we've seen with the research over time is that children who have, let's say, half an hour or an hour, let's say a second grader who has 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours of homework versus a second grader who has no homework, academically, those who have a half hour or an hour or 2 hours, the more homework they have, on average, their academic performance is a little lower. And a lot of socio-emotional factors are quite a bit lower. So the additional homework for the early childhood, middle childhood stages is not really helping their academic performance any more than the intensive instruction in school. So having that intensive instruction in school, teaching the subjects there with the support of a teacher or multiple teachers, aides, tutors, things like that, that's the best context kids are learning in. And then having time after school to do things like play, to explore their own interests. And some of those could be academic. My daughter loves reading, so every week we'll come home with a pile of library books. I think the last time my wife brought home like 14 library books, and almost all of them had been read by like that night. And I'm like, oh man, we've got to like space these out. But she goes and finds the library books and reads them. So that's one of her interests, and it's related to academic performance, right? But it's not a requirement to do X number of hours of reading or X number of pages. Her cousin, so my nephew, really loves math. So for his recent birthday, the parents gave him a math workbook. So he's literally on his own time because he wants to, working ahead on math, and is now ahead of his class because that's an interest to him. But that's something that they're interested and motivated to do themselves intrinsically rather than a fight to do homework at home. So that kind of tension and stress can cause tension and stress in the home. The homework is not helping them as much academically perform as it was originally intended to. So essentially, up until the very last couple of years of middle school, there really shouldn't be homework going home, is what the research is saying. If you have a child in school and you want them to have less homework, I mean, seeing which teachers offer less homework might be good, and moving classes, talking to a teacher. We had a parent-teacher conference with one of my daughter's teachers who was giving like a couple worksheets every day in kindergarten to complete when going home. And we essentially said, I mean, I'm sure we sounded like Karens to her before Karens was even a meme. We were basically like, hey, we're not going to do all these worksheets because she needs that time to do things like play. And the teacher was pretty understanding. I'm sure she kind of hated us and thought we were Karens before Karens was even a meme. But it was better for her socio-emotional development. So this is some things that you might have to do as a caregiver or a parent, things like that. Also, as if you're going into school right now and thinking, hey, I might want to be a teacher, something to be aware of as well, and look at what a program is teaching. See, now that you're gaining the skills with doing question papers of looking into research, look into programs, see if they do seem like they're putting out students who have good up-to-date information in their training. when you're picking, if you're able to have that freedom to pick the kind of school that you're going to for your training. I definitely spent more time on this tangent than I wanted to. It is very relevant, not just for obesity, but definitely in early, middle, and late childhood. And then as you get into, say, middle school, having a little bit of homework can like increase as time goes on. And then by senior year, being able to do a couple hours of homework a night should be acceptable and expected even. But before that, there really shouldn't be much homework. Right now, for example, my daughter is coming home and her assignments are read 20 minutes, which for us, that's not a fight because she likes to read. So that is kind of an appropriate kind of homework, is to do some reading at home. But to be sent home with, say, like English worksheets or math worksheets, it would probably be inappropriate for her level at 8 years old. She does have a little reading sheet that we timer. So like she reads for a minute and it's timed. We see how many words a minute she's reading. So they can track that over the school year. So that's fine. It's really short. I think that's acceptable for homework. In my childhood, I remember having to sit down and do spelling words for up to an hour after school. This is because I was really bad at spelling. I'm still really bad at spelling. See how the academic homework didn't really help me with my spelling? I act as if I'm telling my mom. No, she was doing the best she knew how to. She was like, "This practicing it will help you learn your spelling." My brain we learned didn't work that way to learn how to spell well. That's why I like spell check. So if you ever see a spelling error in my slides, let me know and I will fix it. I probably just literally did not realize it was spelled wrong. So that was definitely longer than I wanted to go on that tangent. Homework, not great in early middle childhood is the main points there. So, but again, trying to fix that, part of it is a system change. Part of it is going to be those hard kind of conversations with a teacher as well. So that can be a struggle, but important as well. So let's take a quick break before we jump into learning disabilities, and we'll talk about them, very relevant to the education aspect that I went off on that tangent for. But let's be back at 10:58 and have a quick break right now. All right, and we are back. So let's talk about neurodivergence and some learning disabilities. So a lot of these have to do with any kind of learning difficulty in understanding or reading written language. So most commonly, this could be problems in thinking, problems with listening, problems with reading, writing, or spelling. So with that, the most common problem that is identified in a school setting tends to be reading, one of the most earliest ones that's seen. So let's talk about one of these disabilities that's specifically around reading, and that's dyslexia. So dyslexia and all of these, they're labeled disabilities in the book. They're labeled disabilities by the DSM-5, so the Diagnostic Statistics Manual for Psychology. Basically, it's a manual, a checklist that lists any kind of disorder or disability, and you have certain criteria to meet to then be diagnosed with dyslexia, depression, schizophrenia. So that's what the DSM-5 does. So that's why it's included here in disabilities. The more recent term has been it's neurodivergent. So one of the main things that we'll see here today as we go through each of these disabilities is that most of them are just the fact that a person's brain is processing a little bit differently than someone who's got a neurotypical brain. So the average brain, you might say, is the neurotypical brain. So someone with dyslexia, their brain is literally processing their sensations and perceptions of letters or numbers or other things a little bit differently. So it's not that. So that's one of the main things. So one of the more up-to-date words to describe these rather than being disabilities is neurodivergence, because we see that with these kind of neurodivergences, while they might not have, well, it might be hard to, well, let's finish reading dyslexia, then we'll talk about neurodivergence. So dyslexia, difficulty to read and spell; dysgraphia, difficulty to write or be able to match sounds and letters and the actual shapes of those things. And then dyscalculia is basically dyslexia for numbers, as well as the symbols used in math. So it's hard to do math with this, difficulty to get the right answer. One example of something someone with dyslexia might experience is maybe letters or numbers, because oftentimes dyslexia and dyscalculia happen at the same time. Some people might have one or the other, though. So there are people who have dyscalculia that don't have dyslexia generally as well. So let's say you're looking at an equation and the numbers seem to be kind of moving or floating around, or your 9 flips over in your mind as you're sensing and perceiving it, and you're reading it as a 6. That's going to be pretty difficult to get the correct answer on a math problem. And so those are some of the kinds of sensations and perceptions you might be experiencing with, say, dyslexia or dyscalculia. You might see for dyslexia, the word doesn't seem to be all the letters in the right place, or a D flips over and it's now a P or something like that. So that can be really difficult. So with this, it is located in multiple parts of the brain. It doesn't seem like there's one specific area that's, say, like malfunctioning or something. It's the integration of information from lots of parts of the brain, and it's just being processed differently than a neurotypical brain. And so this leads to, it's pretty difficult to read because of this neurodivergence. So interventions usually work on improving reading ability, and intensive instruction can really help. So with that intensive instruction, you'd have, say, a tutor or a therapist trying to teach specific skills, see what works for that specific individual. So one person with dyslexia, a couple different reading techniques. For example, one is to take, oh, I don't have anything similar to that on my desk right now. Take a bookmark, basically, with like a bar in the middle that you can kind of slide along. So you're essentially highlighting the words as you read. This is actually, interestingly, a technique to learn how to speed read as well, to look specifically at single words and then be able to look at a line and then look at a couple lines. Same kind of thing that could help some people with dyslexia. For others, other techniques might be more useful. So getting that individualized instruction to figure out how your brain works and how to work with the brain that you're processing with is some of the best things. With that being said, we're starting to understand that, hey, people with neurodivergence, they need to figure out how their brain works specifically, so how they can do a skill like reading with the way their brain is processing it. This is also going to be relevant for someone who's neurotypical as well. So this is why some psychologists will say, like, hey, therapy is good for everybody, because in many ways, especially these kind of cognitive skills, it is figuring out how you're specific, if your brain is neurotypical or neurodivergent. A neurotypical person is going to respond well to having intensive instruction to learn how to do specific cognitive skills, for example. So that's one thing that you can do with, say, a cognitive behavioral therapist. And it wouldn't necessarily only have to be something like, oh, I'm suffering symptoms of depression. You can get therapy for lots of different things. So that intensive instruction is really helpful for neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. If we think of social cognitive learning theory, so the zone of proximal development and scaffolding someone in their learning, you've got to teach at someone's level at what they're able to do. So if you teach skills that help them at that level and build them up, then that zone of proximal development can expand too and teach them new things. So again, these are really findings relevant for both neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. And I think we are doing a better job in schools, maybe not in society in general right now, but definitely in schools. We've been doing a better job at getting intensive instruction and specific teachers with that kind of specialty, or special education teachers, for example, that might be specialized in helping to do that intensive instruction for students with dyslexia. So, but there is definitely room for doing that more, both with neurodivergent kids as well as neurotypical kids. So hopefully that makes neurodivergence a little clearer with these learning disabilities. And next we'll talk about ADHD, which is also another neurodivergence. So essentially some of the diagnostic criteria, so some of those check marks you would have to hit to be diagnosed with ADHD are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So inattention can show up in a couple different ways. One might be having a hard time focusing on one thing, so your attention might jump between things. You might get bored easily, or only be able to stay on task a few minutes and then maybe need to take a break or something like that. So that's some ways that inattention could appear. Hyperactivity, especially in middle and late childhood, you'll see high levels of physical activity. The child might seem constantly in motion. And this is one thing that might lead a lot more children than have this neurodivergent to get tested for ADHD, or the parents might assume that they have ADHD, because high levels of physical activity are pretty common, or should be pretty common in childhood. So being constantly in motion isn't necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. Similarly with impulsivity. So this is difficulty curbing actions and reactions. One example of that is when I try to get off the tangent I was on, but I keep coming back to that tangent. Impulsivity right there. Seeming not to be able to think before acting. Again, this is a similar thing that's pretty common for early children. So their brain is still developing, the prefrontal cortex is still myelinating, so they're not going to be as good at this skill as, say, an adult, just in general. So just because you see impulsivity or hyperactivity, those are usually the most commonly seen from the outside, and then the child is taken in for assessment. And taking in for assessment, that's really useful. So then you can know the differences here between seeing these kinds of symptoms and then it being diagnosed is seeing that those inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity is having some kind of negative impact on that child's life. Oftentimes this might be academic, might be socio-emotional, maybe they're not keeping friends well because in social interactions they're not attentive or they're too impulsive, things like that. So if it's impacting the well-being of the child, essentially at that point, the clinician, so I'm not trained to make those diagnoses, someone would be trained to make those diagnoses and see if it's impacting their day-to-day life to a point where they would say, yep, they've got ADHD. And then the process would be, well, what kinds of treatments would there be? With this, about 9 times as many boys than girls are diagnosed with ADHD, and there are disagreements over the reason for an increasing frequency of diagnosis. Part of that's probably because of better assessments to identify this neurodivergence. Part of it might be also expecting different behavior from children who really should be kind of playing and running around and more active than we might expect them to be in, say, a traditional school setting, like sitting at desks for hours or something like that. So with ADHD, there are these risks of lower academic achievement, underachievement in math and reading, substance abuse, antisocial behavior into adolescence. But again, this is another aspect that it's a neurodivergence. So there does seem to be some genetic tendencies. So thinking back to epigenetics, so there's some genetic tendencies to developing ADHD. Also, brain damage pre or postnatal can cause ADHD later on, but a lot of this comes from prefrontal cortex and the myelination there. So that there's less or thinner or decreased myelination. So this is both in childhood and in adulthood even. So take a picture of maybe my brain versus a person with a neurotypical adult brain. You'll probably see a couple fewer connections, a little less myelination in my brain with this neurodivergence of ADHD versus a neurotypical brain. So this means that my brain, or someone with ADHD, is processing things just slightly differently than a neurotypical person, similar to what we talked about with dyslexia as well. So the brains are processing a little bit differently. So again, intensive individualized instruction can really help. Therapy can really help. I think therapy and medicines are on the next page. So neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin might be involved in ADHD. Most of the medicines used for ADHD affect dopamine and serotonin, and some of them do seem to be really effective at combating some of these symptoms. So stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall are often used. Also, antidepressants are often used. So, and then behavior management helps a lot. So what is generally done for treatment for ADHD, especially in childhood, is either a stimulant or an antidepressant as a medicine, and that's generally going to be affecting dopamine or serotonin. And then behavior management is going to be doing a lot of neurofeedback training. So learning skills and how that individual's brain processes info. So you should hear some similarities here with dyslexia and those learning disabilities. So helping that one individual child figure out which techniques work for them to learn well in the context that they're in. I had a student last period who said that they were diagnosed and they've learned some skills, and now they know in the morning it's not really a great time for them to, like early in the morning is not a great time to do work or do school, but then they have a couple hours where they can manage their emotions, and manage their attention. Then after that, they're kind of have some of those symptoms of hyperactivity again. So learning how your own brain works with individualized attention, with training, neurofeedback training from a therapist, from occupational therapists, school psychologists, those kind of things can be really helpful. Mindfulness is a good technique for people with ADHD. So in mindfulness meditation, I don't think we've actually talked about it in this class much. We've maybe mentioned it, but essentially when you do mindfulness meditation, you'll focus on something like a sound or your breath or maybe a candle or something like that. You'll focus on that. And as other thoughts come to you, you kind of just let them come and go on their own. So if I'm to visualize this, I imagine like those thoughts, let's say, I'm meditating, I'm trying to spend like 10 minutes meditating, a thought comes in into my head that, oh no, I forgot that I have to do maintenance on my car. So I need to take it in for an oil change. With meditating, imagine that's like a thought bubble coming in. And then rather than starting to be stressed about that or grabbing onto that thought bubble and pulling it closer, I let it on its own kind of drift off and evaporate. So that's essentially what you're doing with mindfulness meditation. There's more to it. I think in a later class we might practice mindfulness meditation, but that might be my 1010 class that I'm thinking of. I know we do it in 1010. I think it's in 1100 as well. But another big helpful thing is also physical exercise. So with that, that helps the brain process things a little better. We saw a lot of cognitive benefits for that. So if you're being physically active, your brain is going to be working as it should, essentially. So you're going to have more of the neurochemicals that you need to do different processes at any given time. So those are some things. And then I've learned specific skills for myself that work even now today, that can help me manage some of the more negative aspects of ADHD. But there's also positive aspects with these neurodivergences that come along with them. That's actually a big part of our group activity that we're not going to get to today because we've only got about 5 minutes left in class. But next time, so kind of as a spoiler, we're going to talk about autism spectrum disorders. So I'll give you kind of a spoiler of what our activity will be, because this will probably be one of our first things we do next time. We're going to do some quick research on one of these things that's neurodivergent or a disability. So dyslexia, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and look at what are some things that people with any given specific disability excel at. So you and your group, you'll decide on one. Maybe it's Asperger's syndrome or autism or ADHD. And then you go and do some quick Google scholaring searching, as well as maybe on the APA website, to see what are some things that these people will excel at, because these are neurodivergences. They're a little bit different ways that people's brains process things. And so that leads to some of these symptoms, but it can also lead to some positive benefits as well. And we'll watch a video on one of those positive benefits for autism spectrum disorders next time, because we're definitely not going to have time today. But if you want to, in between now and Thursday, search for that on your own to kind of have a head start, that could be a really good idea as well. Yeah, I just had to check that we are actually ending in 5 minutes. Sometimes I forget which time which class ends. So autism spectrum disorders are essentially a range of disorders that we've categorized under different names. The names pretty well fall under, is this more neurodivergent or is this closer to neurotypical? So you might think, someone might say, hey, my child was diagnosed with autism and they're really severely autistic. Kind of what they're saying there, from a developmental researcher perspective, is that the symptoms of their child and their brain is working further from neurotypical. So they're more neurodivergent than a neurotypical child. So Asperger's syndrome is kind of considered more close to neurotypical, and we'll see some of those things. But with this, whatever the autism spectrum disorder, anybody with this neurodivergent is more sensitive to sensory information. So light, sound, there might be a specific aspect of light or sound or something like that that's specifically triggering or sensitive to for any individual. So also lower level of executive function and specifically working memory. So that can make it difficult to process like what's happening now, bring up previous memories, communicate in a neurotypical way. That's why for autistic disorder, we see a lot of abnormalities in communication. This isn't that they can't process information or they can't communicate or they don't want to communicate. Their brain is working differently and it's leading to communication that's different than neurotypical children. So one big key thing for parents, for researchers, for teachers, for the individualized teachers for children with autism spectrum disorder is, one, learning how they communicate and being able to communicate with them. So this is really important in a family context. If all the siblings know how their sibling communicates, it can lead to a more positive family environment. If nobody knows how to communicate with them, it can be a lot more stressful, a lot more difficult for a parent to then respond to the needs of that child. So oftentimes there's restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior. And so a lot of these things often affect relationships poorly because the person with autism, their brain is processing in a different way. They're communicating in a different way that makes perfect sense to them. But if someone has a neurotypical brain or even a different neurodivergent brain, two people with autism, their brains are going to be working slightly different, just like two neurotypical people are probably having slightly different processings. So Asperger's syndrome, people with this tend to still have relatively good verbal language skills, but they still have the things that we mentioned before. So the sensitivity to sensory information and a lower level of executive function and working memory. But oftentimes, since they can communicate well verbally, it's seen as less severe, or it's seen as closer to neurotypical. So their brain is still processing things in many of the same ways, but they still do have nonverbal language problems, like hard time picking up nonverbal cues, still have repetitive routines or preoccupations with particular subjects. I had one client who their preoccupation was with hive building insects. So some of their communication was kind of through a lens of hive building insects. So they would describe themselves to me as they would kind of like a metaphor, like they were like this kind of thing. I don't remember a specific instance, but say a drone in a beehive. And so to communicate with them, understanding that subject of bees and termites and ants helped with that communication with them. One, because it was one of their preoccupations in a particular subject that we could talk about, but also because some of how they communicated was kind of through that lens as well. And that was one specific individual, and how I worked with them. So that's not going to be exactly the same way you'd work with any child with this kind of neurodivergence. The big key here is, similar to the others, is that intensified training and teaching. So having one-on-one tutoring, one-on-one teaching for this child, having the parents being involved in that, so and the family involved, so that they learn how to communicate with the child, how the child is communicating, how the child's brain is working, teaching the child how their brain is working. So those are skills that will help them well into adulthood as well. So we'll talk about IEPs, which are really important. I think that's where we'll start off next time, because that's a lot of how we do this individualized teaching and try to keep it consistent across the school years. I feel like we breezed through some of those so much quicker than I wanted to, but I did go into a couple of tangents in more detail than I wanted to, so I apologize for that and for being rushed here. Definitely send me emails of questions that you have, or come to class next time with those questions first thing, so we can talk about them in more depth. If you have experience with children or yourself with any of these neurodivergences, it would be great to talk about those next time. But we are at the end of class, so I will let you go. Thank you for being here today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.